Saint Simeon in the temple, after having received the divine child in his arms, predicted to Mary was to be the mark for all the opposition and persecution of men, set for a sign which shall be contradicted, and that, therefore, the sword of sorrow should pierce her own soul. The Holy Virgin herself said to Saint Matilda that at the announcement of Saint Simeon, all her joy was changed into sorrow, for, as it was revealed to Saint Teresa, the Blessed Mother, although she knew before this that the life of her son would be sacrificed for the salvation of the world, yet she then learned more particularly and distinctly the sufferings and cruel death that awaited her poor son. She knew that he would be contradicted in all things, contradicted in doctrine, for instead of being believed, he would be esteemed a blasphemer for teaching that he was the Son of God, as the impious Caiaphas declared him to be, saying, "He has blasphemed, he is guilty of death." Contradicted in his reputation, for he was noble, of royal lineage, and was despised as a peasant. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary? As a false prophet, and they blindfolded him and smote his face, saying, "Prophesy, who is that struck you?" He was treated as a madman. "He is mad, why do you listen to him?" As a winebibber, a glutton, and a friend of sinners. Behold a man that is a glutton and a drinker of wine, a friend of publicans and sinners. As a sorcerer, by the prince of devils he casts out devils. As a heretic and possessed person. He was contradicted in his soul, for even his eternal Father, in order to give place to the divine justice, contradicted him by not wishing to hear him when he prayed to him, saying, "Father, if it be possible, let this chalice pass from me," and abandoned him to fear, weariness, and sadness, so that our afflicted Lord said, "My soul is sorrowful even unto death." His interior suffering even caused him to sweat blood. Contradicted and persecuted, in a word, in his body and in his life, for he was tortured in all his sacred members, in his hands, in his feet, in his face, and in his head, in his whole body, until, drained to the last drop of his blood, he died an ignominious death on the cross. Mary received with the greatest calmness the announcement that her son should die, and peacefully continued to submit to it. But what grief she must have continually suffered, seeing this amiable son always near her, hearing from him words of eternal life, and beholding his holy demeanor. The Blessed Virgin herself revealed to St.Bridget that while she lived on the earth, there was not an hour when this grief did not pierce her soul. "As often," she continued, "as often as I looked upon my son, as often as I wrapped him in his swaddling clothes, as often as I saw his hands and feet, so often was my soul overwhelmed, as it were, with a fresh sorrow, because I considered how he would be crucified." If, then, Jesus our King and his most holy Mother did not refuse, for love of us, to suffer during their whole life such cruel pains, there is no reason that we should complain if we suffer a little. Jesus crucified once appeared to a Sister Magdalene Orsini, a Dominican nun, who had she been long suffering a great trial, and encouraged her to remain with him on the cross, with that sorrow that was afflicting her. Sister Magdalene answered him complainingly, "O Lord, thou didst suffer on the cross only 3 hours, but it is more than 3 years that I have been suffering this cross." Then the Redeemer replied, "Ah, ignorant soul, what dost thou say? I, from the first moment I was conceived, suffered in heart what I afterwards suffered on the cross." Father Riviglione of the Company of Jesus relates that a certain youth practiced the devotion of visiting every day an image of the sorrowful Mary, in which she was represented with 7 swords piercing her heart. One night the unhappy youth fell into mortal sin. Going next morning to visit the image, he saw in the heart of the Blessed Virgin not only 7, but 8 swords. As he stood gazing at this, he heard a voice saying to him that this sin had added the 8th sword to the heart of Mary. This softened his hard heart, and he went immediately to confession, and through the intercession of his advocate, recovered the divine grace. Let us now pass to the consideration of the second sword of sorrow, which wounded Mary in the flight of her infant Jesus into Egypt from the persecution of Herod. Herod, having heard that the expected Messiah was born, foolishly feared that the newborn king would deprive him of his kingdom. Herod, therefore, waited to learn from the holy Magi where the king was born, that he might take him from his life. But finding himself deceived by the Magi, he ordered all the infants that could be found in the neighborhood of Bethlehem to be put to death. But an angel appeared in a dream to Saint Joseph and said to him, "Arise and take the child and his mother and fly into Egypt." Immediately on that very night, Joseph made this command known to Mary, and taking the infant Jesus, they commenced their journey, as it seems clearly from the Gospel itself, who arose and took the child and his mother by night and retired into Egypt. Mary knew that already the prophecy of Simeon regarding her son was beginning to be verified. He is set for a sign which shall be contradicted. Seeing that scarcely is he born when he is persecuted to death. What suffering it must have been to the heart of Mary, writes St. John Chrysostom, to hear the tidings of that cruel exile of herself with her son. Everyone can imagine how much Mary must have suffered on this journey. It was a long distance to Egypt. Authors generally agree with Barada that it was 400 miles, so that it was at least a journey of 30 days. The way, as St. Bonaventure describes it, was rough, unknown, through the woods, with unused paths. The season was the winter, and therefore they had to travel in snow, rain, wind, and storms, and through bad and difficult roads. Mary was then 15 years of age, a delicate virgin, unaccustomed to such journeys. St. Bonaventure asks, where did they obtain food? Where did they rest at night? How were they lodged? What other food could they have had, other than a piece of hard bread which Joseph brought with him, or begged in charity? Where could they have slept, particularly in those 200 miles of desert through which they traveled, where, as authors relates, there were neither houses nor inns, except maybe on the sand or under some tree in the wood, or in the open air, exposed to robbers, or those wild beasts which Egypt is abounded? If anyone had met these three greatest personages of the world, what would he have believed them to be but three poor roving beggars? One day the Most Holy Mary appeared to the Blessed Coletta, a Franciscan nun, and showed her the infant Jesus in a basin, torn in pieces, and then said to her, "Thus sinners continually treat my son, renewing his death and my sorrows. O my daughter, pray for them that they may be converted." The Lord having then given us the Virgin Mary as an example of perfection, it was necessary that she should be laden with sorrows, that in her we might admire and imitate her heroic patience. The sorrow that we are this day to consider is one of the greatest which our Divine Mother suffered during her life, namely, the loss of her son in the temple. In the second chapter of St. Luke, we read that the Blessed Virgin, being accustomed to visit the temple every year at the Paschal season, with Joseph her spouse and Jesus, once went when he was about 12 years old, and Jesus remained in Jerusalem, although she was not aware of it, for she thought he was in the company with the others. When she reached Nazareth, she inquired for her son, and not finding him there, she returned immediately to Jerusalem to seek him, but did not succeed until after 3 days. Now let us imagine what distress that afflicted mother must have experienced in those 3 days, in which she was searching everywhere for her son. Oh, with how much greater tenderness must Mary, overcome with fatigue, and yet not having found her beloved son, have repeated those words of Reuben, considering his brother Joseph, "The boy doth not appear, and whither shall I go?" Weeping continually, she repeated during these 3 days with David, "My tears have been my bread day and night, whilst it said to me daily, Where is thy God?" During the nights the afflicted mother had no rest, but wept and prayed without ceasing to God that he would enable her to find her son. Some writers assert, and not without reason, that this sorrow was not only one of the greatest, but that it was the greatest and most painful of all. For in the first place, Mary in her other sufferings had Jesus with her. She suffered when St. Simeon uttered the prophecy in the temple. She suffered in the flight into Egypt, but always with Jesus. and in this sorrow she suffered at a distance from Jesus, without knowing where he was. Secondly, Mary well understood the cause and end of the other sorrows, namely, the redemption of the world, the divine will. But in this she did not know the cause of the absence of her son. This sorrowful mother was grieved to find Jesus withdrawn from her, for in her humility made her consider herself unworthy to remain with Jesus any longer and attend upon him on earth and have the care of such a treasure. And perhaps she may have thought within herself, I have not served him as I ought. Perhaps I have been guilty of some neglect, and therefore he has left me. And therefore Mary never complained in any other sorrow but this, lovingly saying to Jesus after she found him, Son, why hast thou done this to us? Thy father and I have been looking everywhere for you. By these words she did not wish to reprove Jesus, as the heretics blasphemously assert, but only to make known to him the grief that she had experienced during his absence from her, on account of the love she bore him. It was not a rebuke, says Blessed Denis the Carthusian, but a loving complaint. The sorrow of Mary out, in the first place, to serve as a comfort to those souls who are desolate and do not enjoy the sweet presence they once enjoyed of their Lord. They may weep, but let them weep in peace, as Mary wept in the absence of her son. Let them take courage and not fear that on this account they have lost the divine favor. For God himself said to St. Teresa, No one is lost without knowing it, and no one is deceived without wishing to be deceived. If the Lord departs from the sight of that soul who loves him, he does not therefore depart from the heart. He often hides himself that she may seek him with greater desire and love, but those who would find Jesus must seek him, not amid delights and pleasures of the world, but amid crosses and mortifications, as Mary sought him. Learn from Mary to seek Jesus. All the sorrows of the world united would not be equal to the sorrow of the glorious Mary. Yes, because this mother, as St. Lawrence Justinian writes, the more tenderly she loved was the more deeply wounded. The greater the tenderness with which she loved him, the greater her grief at the sight of his sufferings, especially when she met her son, after he had already been condemned, going to death at the place of punishment, and now bearing the cross. And this is the fourth sort of sorrow which today we have to consider. The Blessed Virgin revealed to St. Bridget that at the time when the Passion of our Lord was drawing nigh, her eyes were always filled with tears, as she thought of her beloved Son, whom she was about to lose on the earth. Therefore, as she also said, a cold sweat covered her body from the fear that seized her at that prospect of approaching suffering. St. John came and announced to Mary that the most unjust Pilate had already condemned him to death upon the cross. Ah, sorrowful mother, said St. John to her, thy son has already been condemned to death, for he is already on his way bearing himself his cross on his way to Calvary, as he afterwards relates in his Gospel. And bearing his own cross, he went forth to that place which is called Calvary. Mary goes with John, and she perceives by the blood with which the way was sprinkled that her son had already passed there. This she revealed to St. Bridget. By the footsteps of my son I traced his course, for along the way by which he passed, the ground was sprinkled with blood. While Mary stopped in that place, how much she must have heard said against her son by the Jews who knew her, and perhaps also words of mockery of herself. Alas, what a commencement of sorrows was then before her eyes, when she saw the nails, the hammers, the cords, the fatal instruments of the death of her son borne before him. And what a sword pierced her heart when she heard the trumpet proclaiming along the way the sentence pronounced against her son. But behold now, after the instruments, the trumpets, and the ministers of justice had passed, she raised her eyes and sees a young man covered with blood and wounds from head to foot, with a crown of thorns on his head and 2 heavy beams on his shoulders. She looks at him and hardly knows him, saying then with Isaiah, And we have seen him, and there was no sightliness. Yes, for the wounds, the bruises, and clotted blood made him look like a leper. We have thought him, as it were, a leper, so that he could no longer be recognized. But at length they looked at each other. The son wipes from his eyes the clotted blood, which prevented him from seeing, as was revealed to St. Bridget, and looks upon the mother, and the mother looks upon the Son. Ah, looks of sorrow which pierced, as with so many arrows, those two holy and loving souls. The mother wished to embrace him, as St. Anselm says, but the officers of justice thrust her aside, loading her with insults, and urge on our afflicted Lord. Mary follows. The Savior appeared one day to Sister Diomira, a nun in Florence, and said to her, "Think of me and love me, and I will think of thee and love thee." And at the same time he presented her with a bunch of flowers and the cross, signifying to her by this that the consolations of the saints on this earth are always to be accompanied by the cross. There is nothing more to be said, says St. John, of the martyrdom of Mary. Behold her at the foot of the cross, looking on at her dying Son, and then see if there is grief like her grief. Let us stop then also today on Calvary to consider this fifth sword that pierced the heart of Mary, namely the death of Jesus. When they had crucified him, they planted the cross and thus left him to die. The executioners abandoned him, but Mary does not abandon him. She then draws nearer to the cross in order to assist at his death. "I did not leave him," thus the Blessed Virgin revealed to St. Bridget, and stood nearer to his cross. Behold the words in which Mary revealed to St. Bridget the pitiable state of her dying Son as she saw him on the cross. My dear Jesus was on the cross in grief and in agony. His eyes were sunken, half closed, and lifeless, the lips hanging, and the mouth open, the cheeks hollow, and attached to the teeth, the face lengthened, the nose sharp, the countenance sad. The head had fallen upon his breast, the hair black with blood, the stomach collapsed, the arms and legs stiff, and the whole body covered with wounds and blood. Mary also suffered all these pains of Jesus. Every torture inflicted on the body of Jesus, says St. Jerome, was a wound in the heart of the mother. Any one of us who should have then have been on Mount Calvary would have seen two altars, says St. John Chrysostom, on which two great sacrifices were consummating, one in the body of Jesus, the other in the heart of Mary. St. Augustine also says the same thing. The cross and the nails of the Son were also the cross and the nails of the Mother. Christ being crucified, the Mother was also crucified. Yes, because as St. Bernard says, love inflicted on the heart of Mary the same suffering that the nails caused in the body of Jesus. Therefore, at the same time that the Son was sacrificing his body, the Mother, as St. Bernardino says, was sacrificing her soul. The Blessed Virgin herself said to St. Bridget, "I heard some call my Son a thief. I heard others call him an impostor. Others said no one deserved death more than he, and every word was to me a new sort of sorrow." But what increased most the sorrows which Mary suffered through compassion for her Son was to hear him complain on the cross that even the Eternal Father had abandoned him. my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Words which, as the Divine Mother herself said to St. Bridget, could never depart from her mind during her whole life. Thus the afflicted mother saw her Jesus suffering on every side. She desired to comfort him, but could not. Jesus himself revealed to St. Bridget, "My mother Mary, on account of her compassion and charity, was made mother of all in heaven and on earth." And indeed, these were the last 7 words with which Jesus took leave of her before his death. This was his last remembrance, leaving us to her for her children in the person of John, when he said to her, "Woman, behold thy son." And from that time, Mary began to perform for us this office of a good mother. For as St. Peter Damian declares, the penitent thief, through the prayers of Mary, was then converted and saved. Therefore the good thief repented, because the Blessed Virgin, standing between the cross of her Son and that of the thief, prayed her Son for him, thus rewarding by this favor his former service. For as other authors also relate, this thief, in the journey to Egypt with the infant Jesus, showed them kindness, and this same office the Blessed Virgin has continued and still continues to perform. A young man in Perugia once promised the devil that if he would help him to commit a sinful act which he desired to do, he would give him his soul, and he gave him a writing to that effect signed with his blood. The evil deed was committed, and the devil demanded the performance of the promise. He led the young man to a well and threatened to take him body and soul to hell if he would not cast himself in it. The wretched youth, thinking that it would be impossible for him to escape from his enemy, climbed the well side in order to cast himself into it. But terrified at the thought of death, he said to the devil that he had not the courage to throw himself in, and that, if he wished to see him dead, he himself should thrust him in. The young man wore about his neck the scapular of the sorrowing Mary, and the devil said to him, "Take off that scapular, and I will thrust you in." But the youth, seeing the protection which the Divine Mother still gave him through that scapular, refused to take it off, and after a great deal of altercation, the devil departed in confusion. The sinner repented, and grateful to his sorrowful mother, went to thank her, and presented a picture of this case as an offering at her altar in the new church of Santa Maria in Perugia. A devout author says that when our Redeemer was dead, the heart of the Great Mother was first engaged in accompanying the most holy soul of the Son and presenting it to the Eternal Father. "I present thee, O my God," Mary must have then said, "the immaculate soul of thy and my Son, which has been obedient to thee even unto death. Receive it then in thy arms. Thy justice is now satisfied, thy will accomplished. Behold, the great sacrifice to thy eternal glory is consummated." And then turning to the lifeless members of her Jesus, "O wounds," she said, "O loving wounds, I adore you, I rejoice with you. Since through you salvation has been given to the world, you shall remain open in the body of my Son, to be the refuge of those who will have recourse to you. Oh, how many, through you, shall receive the pardon of their sins, and then through you shall be inflamed to love the sovereign good. Oh, how many swords," says St. Bonaventure, "pierced the soul of this mother, when she received the body of her Son after it was taken from the cross. Let us consider what anguish it would cause any mother to receive the lifeless body of a son." Bernardino describes the afflicted mother as raising herself and extending her arms to meet her dear Son. She embraces him and then sits down at the foot of the cross. She sees his mouth open, his eyes shut. She examines the lacerated flesh and those exposed bones. She takes off the crown and sees the cruel injury made by those thorns in that sacred head. She looks upon those pierced hands and feet and says, "Ah, my Son, to what has the love thou didst spare to men reduced thee? But what evil hast thou done to them, that they have treated thee so cruelly?" The Virgin herself revealed to St.Bridget that she closed the eyes of her Son when he was taken down from the cross, but she could not close his arms. Jesus Christ giving us to understand by this that he desired to remain with open arms to receive all penitent sinners who return to him. Once there was a poor sinner who, among other crimes, had killed his father and a brother, and therefore he became a fugitive. Happening to hear one day during Lent a sermon upon the Divine Mercy, he went to the preacher himself to make his confession. The confessor, having heard his crimes, sent him to the altar of the Sorrowful Mother to pray that she might obtain for him compunction and pardon of sins. The sinner obeyed and began to pray, when behold, suddenly overpowered by contrition, he falls down dead. On the following day, when the priest recommended to the people to pray for the deceased, a white dove appeared in the church and let fall a card at the feet of the priest. He took it up and found these words written on it: "The soul of the dead, when it left the body, immediately went to paradise. And do you continue to preach the infinite mercy of God." Behold the last sorrow which we are to consider, when Mary, after being present at the death of her Son upon the cross, after having embraced his lifeless body, was finally to leave him in the tomb, never more to enjoy his beloved presence. Thus Mary, clinging to her Son, was dissolved in grief, but those holy disciples, fearing lest this poor mother would expire there through agony, went to take the body of her Son from her arms to bear it away for burial. Therefore, with reverential force, they took him from her arms, and having embalmed him, wrapped him in a linen cloth already prepared, upon which our Lord wished to leave to the world his image impressed, as may be seen at the present day in Turin. The sorrowful funeral train sets forth. The disciples place him on their shoulders. hosts of angels from heaven accompany him. Those holy women follow him, and the afflicted mother follows in their company to her son's grave. When they reach the appointed place, how gladly would Mary have buried herself there alive with her son! "Oh, how willingly," said the Virgin to St. Bridget, "would I have remained there with my son, if it had been his will." Finally, they took the stone to close up the holy tomb and the body of Jesus, that great treasure, greater than any in heaven and on earth. And here let us remark that Mary left her heart buried with Jesus, because Jesus was all her treasure. Before leaving the tomb, according to St. Bonaventure, Mary blessed that sacred stone, saying, "O happy stone, that doth now enclose that body which was contained 9 months in my womb. I bless thee and envy thee. I leave thee to guard my son for me, who is my only good, my only love." And then turning to the eternal Father, she said, "O Father, to thee I recommend him, who is thy son and mine." And thus, bidding a last farewell to her son and to the tomb, she returned to her own house. Father Engelgrave relates that a certain religious was so tormented by scruples that sometimes he was almost driven to despair. But having great devotion to Mary, the Mother of Sorrows, he had recourse to her in the agony of his spirit, and was much comforted by contemplating her sorrows. Death came, and the devil tormented him more than ever with scruples, and tempted him to despair, when behold our merciful Mother, seeing her poor son so afflicted, appeared to him and said to him, "And why, O my son, art thou so overcome with sorrow? Thou who hast so often consoled me by thy compassion for my sorrows, be comforted," she said to him. "Jesus sends me to thee to console thee. Be comforted, rejoice, and come with me to paradise." And at these words the devout religious expired, full of consolation and confidence.